fractures, prevention, and treatment, a topic that interests all of us in this room a great deal. It's an interest that the Health Club worries about, frets about, talks about. And this afternoon, we have the opportunity to hear a gentleman who, in fact, has a great deal of information about this. And as you probably know, it is Dr. Ron Wilder. I said Wilder, not Wilding. We really hope you enjoyed it. It's going to be a wonderful presentation. I could spend 10, 20 minutes talking about his expansive credentials, but I'm not going to even take 30 seconds. You will hear about them as he goes through his slideshows. But he is the right man to be here, and I'm very excited about this. So here he is, Dr. Ron Wilder.
Thank you, Marcella. As Marcella said, this is a topic, in fact, I suspect every one of you in the room has had an experience with a fall or knows someone who has fallen. It is clearly something that needs to be dealt with. My own interest in falls actually dates really a long time back when I was a fellow. I can tell you one of my patients with rheumatoid arthritis, she fell in her apartment, broke her hip, and laid there for 3 days before someone discovered her. And I can tell you the sequelae that ended her days of living independently. She ended up having to go into full-time assisted care, and life went downhill from there. I've experienced a lot of patients over the years that have had fractures and sequelae. Even here at System, I've witnessed at least 4 people fall. I'm aware of multiple other people I didn't witness who had suffered injuries, so I know it's a big problem here. Personally, this problem has hit me. My own father, 5 years ago, fell, broke his hip, and 3 months later he was dead. So this is a serious problem. On a more personal level, everybody falls, but it becomes frequent. My wife Debbie here, we were at the Bulls-Durham game, Durham Bulls game rather, a couple of years back, and we were just walking along. She caught her foot on a grate and flat face down on her face. So even relatively young people can fall. And then they come to me personally. I have fallen, and as my wife can attest to, just about a month ago in this bathroom on a slippery floor, down I went. So it can happen to all of us very, very, very quickly. So I've had an acute interest in this topic going a long while back. I read the medical literature constantly on this, and I'd like to impart a little bit of what I have learned. Now I know some of you know my background, but I know a lot of you know little about it, so let me just tell you a little about who I am. So I'm one of those science nerds. As long as I can remember, when I was a kid, I was interested in science and medicine. That interest never wavered. I went out and got my undergraduate degree in chemistry, and then went to UCLA, and simultaneously got both an MD and a PhD in molecular biology. I did an internal medicine internship and residency at the University of California in San Diego. And then followed that, I moved east, went to the National Institutes of Health, National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease to be specific, and did a 3-year fellowship in immunology. I followed that up with a 2-year fellowship in the National Institutes of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Skin Diseases, and that's where my rheumatology training actually started. Partway through that fellowship, I was offered a senior investigator position and ultimately became chief of the Inflammatory Joint Diseases program at the NIH. There, my work really centered on the etiology, the pathogenesis, genetics, and therapy of rheumatoid arthritis and related autoimmune diseases. I also served as an attending physician at the clinical center at the National Institutes of Health. That led to a 25-year career at the NIH. I left there and retired and moved into the corporate world and took a position as Vice President for Clinical Development at MedImmune, which at that time was a mid-sized biotech company. There my work was really more centered on new drug development, selecting targets and agents, coming up with clinical development plans, negotiating with the FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory agencies around the world, writing clinical trials, executing clinical trials, analyzing clinical trials, reporting clinical trials. I did that until AstraZeneca, a great big pharmaceutical company, took them over, and I moved actually to the other end of the biotech world, became chief medical officer at a small startup, venture capital-backed company called Macrogenics. That was an exhilarating job. I had a portfolio of products in the autoimmune diseases, West Nile virus, and cancer. I loved the science. I hated the business end of it. The pressure was enough to make me want to leave after 4 years, but I learned a lot. And then I moved to a global consulting and a contract research organization called ParExcel, where we provided consulting help to any of the 3,000 biotech and biopharm companies around the world. So I got to experience medicine around the world. I've published about 400 articles and or chapters in the medical literature. I'm honored to have been elected a fellow and a master in the American College of Rheumatology. And although I've retired from active practice, I still do have an active license, and I'm still maintaining my certification in internal medicine and rheumatology. And one of my major interests these days, in fact, is falls and fractures. So, I want to back up one thing. Now, I hear a lot of people say, you know, I can't believe anything I read, I hear in the newspapers, because medical evidence comes out in a very, very discoordinated way. And people don't realize that medical literature is actually very, very organized, and there's a hierarchy of how it's reviewed. And I'm going to talk about this. My talk is really medical evidence-based. Most of what I'm going to say is not just my personal opinion. It's really based upon the literature. So I thought I'd just go over what the hierarchy of medical literature. So at the top of the list is the physician personal opinion and experience. That actually is lowest level of evidence, which we call anecdotal. It can't be generalized. So it's worth listening to opinions of individual physicians in terms of experience in single cases, but it doesn't mean a lot. A higher level would be a series of cases, 5, 10, 20 cases, etc., where you can start to see something repeatable. Still very, very hard to generalize that level of evidence. Higher level of evidence of that would be an observational cohort study. For example, you're going to follow a bunch of people that have different cholesterol levels and look at outcomes, heart attacks, strokes, whatever. Or you're going to look at a bunch of patients that have low bone density and look at fracture incidence. Now the problem with that's more powerful data, but the problem with it is that you can't really assume causation. Give an example. Let's say we're looking at for the cause of allergies. Well, you make the observation, allergies appear in the spring. Okay, it's long days. The days are getting longer and those cause the allergy. Well, there's a grain of truth to that, but it's not causal. So the point is, observational data gives you insights to what might be going on, but they're very, very hard to pin down causation. Getting to more powerful data is what we call a randomized clinical trial. Here you might take 2 patients, or a group of patients, with the same kind of attributes, just like low bone density. And you give one standard of care of therapy and the other an experimental therapy. And you measure the number of fractures that occur at some point in time. That is a randomized controlled trial, and it's a much more powerful piece of data. Other single trials can also be wrong. So better is to have multiple randomized clinical trials. The data gets stronger, much less bias there. An analysis of multiple trials and what we call a meta-analysis is even a more powerful way to discern evidence. Ultimately, what is done is you get a group of subject matter experts, maybe associate, well, the FDA does this, American College of Cardiology, American Geriatric Society, whatever. They will review the evidence and they'll assign grades. Grade A means it's strongly supported, B, moderately supported, grade I means it's indeterminate. They can't tell whether it works or it doesn't work. And grade D means the evidence suggested that the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. So I'm going to talk about